Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started today with our meeting on NMR Super-sequences for small molecule characterization. I am going to now present a video from our sponsor.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Once again, great subject material today. I've got a very, very good panel lined up and looking forward to it. MR Resources and Q1 Instruments are very happy to be bringing the IVAN meetings to you. And MR Resources, of course, have been around for over 35 years at this point and providing reconditioned NMR systems, magnets, consoles, probes, service contracts, quench magnet recovery, and certainly moving and relocation. In fact, they've got a very impressive inventory of reconditioned instruments on hand, and three in particular, very spectacular offering, all Bruker Avance 3, 600s, 700s, and they've even got a 950 in inventory at this point, all with cryo probes. Certainly check them out, get in touch if any of these interest you. And Q1 Instruments, a little bit newer to the industry, but Eric, could you give us some brief information on Q1, please?
We invite you to get to know Q1. Q1 designs and manufactures NMR spectrometers from 400 to 600 megahertz with features for routine use and the research laboratory. Want to upgrade an older system without blowing your budget? Q1 can retrofit AS and UltraShield magnets with complete upgrades, including automation, for less than you think. Q1 offers NMR instruments with excellent performance at an unbeatable price. Experts know the key to performance is the probe, and Q1 offers smart tune and match probes by Q1 Tech. Q1 Tech has decades of experience and leads the market in innovation. Q1 STM probes have a patented hybrid tuning mechanism, which means faster tuning for improved throughput and unmatched reliability. Q1 offers their 400 megahertz instrument with STM probes in 3 configurations. A 2-channel probe with fluorine tuning on both X and H channels for maximum flexibility. Or fluorine detection can be isolated to the X or H channel to maximize H sensitivity or to maximize carbon and phosphorus sensitivity. Q1 Tech STM probes are also integrated into Upspin and VNMRJ for improved performance and throughput for existing installations. To know more, our websites have additional info. We're also happy to provide remote demonstrations with your samples. Please contact us by phone or email.
Thank you, Eric. Very capable lineup. Please do check out Q1 Instruments. Krish, could you give us some information on upcoming meeting?
Thank you, John. Thank you, Don and Eric. I am substituting today for our typical MC, Dave Rice, who is vacationing somewhere in New Zealand, having fun. So before I pass it to today's meeting panel leader, I want to announce the upcoming meetings. The next one is coming very fast on November 10th by Travis Gregar on industrial application of benchtop NMR part 2. So we had one last month, and the next month would be the second half of that from 3M. And he is joined by Greg Webster from AbbVie, Adam Sutton from Merck, Mark Milton from Takeda, and Chris Thomas from 3M. Following that, in December, the 1st of December, we have introductory bio-NMR by Murali Nagarajan from Rutgers University. He'll be joined by Ranjit Ghosh from City University of New York and Andrew Newcob from Rutgers. And with that, the 2022 IVAN meetings will come to conclusion. Then we start again in 2023 with 2 topics that are coming down the pike. One on Fourier transform and time domain NMR are complementary for metabolomics by Istvan Pelcher from Princeton University, and water suppression methods by Mikhail Rebark from Merck. Those exact dates are yet to be finalized. Watch your email for announcements. With that, today we have Tim Claridge from University of Oxford leading a topic on NMR super-sequences for small molecule characterization. And I will palm it to Tim to introduce the panel and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Krish. And thanks to all the organisers for inviting us to present this workshop on supersequences today. So I'm just going to share my screen to get us underway. So yeah, we're going to talk about NMR sequences for primarily characterizing small molecules today. And there's 4 members of the panel going to be speaking. So I will start by giving a broad overview of what supersequences are and what they can do for us. And then Eriks Kupce from Bruker UK will talk a bit more about the sort of design concepts that underlie the supersequences and how they work, how some of the elements work. And then Yong, who's a graduate student that's just finishing with me in Oxford, actually, we'll talk a bit more about how one can practically implement supersequences if you wish to get them going yourselves. And then at the end, Hansen from Ohio State will talk about some applications of NOAA in some slightly different areas. They were slightly more biological focused. So talking about some NOAA applications to metabolomics and to labeled biomolecules, in fact, which have their own challenges. So I'll begin with a short overview of supersequences. So why supersequences? Why are they needed? Well, I think everybody on the meeting today will appreciate the importance of 2D NMR and its use in characterization of small structures. And of course, we spend a lot of money on rather fancy and expensive NMR instruments. So the question is, how can we get more for our money? How can we get more information out of our instruments? And one element of that is how can we collect our data more quickly? And of course, there are many approaches to this already that are in standard use in many cases. So of course, we can take a brute force approach. We can use high sensitivity instrument. We can implement cryogenic probes, boost our sensitivity so we have to collect fewer transients to collect any of our data sets. We can change the way we sample data in conventional sequences, so we can implement sparse data collection, such as non-uniform sampling, and this has been a topic of one of the IPA meetings previously. And of course, by doing that, we reduce the number of data points we're collecting as we build our 2D data set, and therefore reduce the time required to acquire that data, and we then recalculate effectively the missing points to make up our full 2D data set. On modern instrumentation or relatively recent instrumentation, we can do multiple receiver experiments. We can collect the NMR signature from multiple nuclei in any one experiment, and therefore collect more data per unit time in the production of the 2D experiment. So in this example here, very simply, we're collecting both proton and fluorine data in parallel, so parallel NMR spectroscopy. And then perhaps the ultimate example of fast data acquisition is the ultra-fast single scan methodology, whereby rather than collecting separate T1 increments, the slices that we encode within a sample constitute each T1 increment effectively, and therefore in a single acquisition, we can get all the data needed to build up a 2-dimensional data set. That's a rather more esoteric way of collecting this data and is rather less widely used, so we won't talk about that any further today, but the earlier elements here are all relevant to the supersequences as well, as we'll see later. So as said, I mean, everyone here will be familiar with the use of 2D NMR methods for characterization. There's a sort of core set which is widely adopted now for doing this. And generally, when we collect these using the classical approach, we collect them as standalone single experiments, transform the data, and we get our resulting 2D data matrix at the end for the analysis. Now, all of these sequences can be represented in a sort of similar cartoon fashion, whereby we start with recovery delay in our sequence, and then we have our experiment itself, our collection of radio frequency pulses, gradient pulses, and so on, before we actually collect our signal itself and then generally we will cycle back round to either collect more transients and or to collect the increments for T1 evolution as required. So all these sequences can be represented in a very similar sort of Cartesian representation here. And of course, what differs is the details of the pulse sequence allows us to sample the different correlations that exist within our molecules that we want to establish through bond and through space and so on. Now, if we were to redraw these sequences in a slightly more realistic time frame, then each of these experiments would actually look a little bit more like what we see here. So this is with a fairly modest 1 second recovery delay in each case. So these are now proportioned to scale for the time elements involved. And what we see from this for all these sequences quite clearly is that the dominant time element in any of these is in fact just a recovery delay, the time we need to wait for our magnetization to recover before we can repeat our pulse sequence itself. And of course, in that time, our instrument is effectively doing nothing for us. It's sitting there just waiting. So although we need the relaxation, in some senses, we can consider this to be dead instrument time. So the idea behind the supersequences really is to collect or reimagine the way we collect these individual experiments and somehow combine them in such a way that we can use just a single recovery delay at the beginning to allow all our magnetization to relax that we need to sample, and then subsequent to that to collect all the different experiments just in one, rather than doing, in this case, 4 separate experiment steps. And of course, by doing this, we actually save a lot of instrument time because we just need that one long recovery delay at the beginning rather than multiple recovery delays for each of the different experiments that exist that we're collecting in this case. And that's where our time saving comes. The more of these elements we can put together, the greater the time saving that we get in collecting the data. Now, this sort of idea has actually been around for quite a long time, and we can go back to 1984 for a very early example of what might be called a supersequence. This is the nesting of homonuclear experiments into one supersequence. So classically, of course, we have a cozy and a nosy pulse sequences shown here, and normally these will be collected as individuals and then transformed to give us our 2 resultant data sets, 2D data matrices. But it's possible to nest these together in such a way that we can collect the cozy experiment within the nosy experiment. After the second pulse here, we have both longitudinal and transverse magnetization. The transverse element here is collected, which gives us our cozy signal, whilst the longitudinal component allows the buildup of the NOE during this mixing time. So we can later subsequently sample that to give our nosy data. So in this so-called COCO-nosy experiment, combined cozy and nosy experiment, we can collect 2 data sets in the same time as one, and then we need to process to separate these data to give us our 2 separate 2D spectra. So in this case, effectively, we're buying one, we're getting one free. We're getting 2 for the time of one, effectively. You get the 2 experiments and the time taken to collect a conventional nosy data set. And this is following the same concept of the supersequences. And in fact, these 2 experiments were published simultaneously, effectively, by 2 independent groups back in 1984. These are the original papers. They were in the same edition of JMR, just a few pages apart, in fact. And the data sets at the bottom show the cozy and the nosy that result, and they look like classical 2D experiments that you would expect to see from separate standalone acquisitions. But we wish to generalize this concept more because we want to obviously collect a broader range of 2D experiments. We have homonuclear experiments, we have heteronuclear experiments we wish to collect. And to do that, we have to consider the concept of isotopologues that we have in any of our NMR experiments or NMR samples that we study at natural abundance. So these are the molecules that differ only in their isotopic composition. So we have some examples shown here. So for example, we can distinguish different pools of proton magnetization for each of these different isotopologues. So we can have the red protons that are directly attached to a carbon-13, directly coupled to carbon-13. The brown ones will be long-range correlation interactions with carbon-13. And each of these different pools effectively only comprise just 1% of our total proton pool, proton magnetization that exists within our NMR sample. Now, equally, we might consider protons that are directly coupled to M15, in which case that constitutes just 0.4% of our total proton pool that exists. And the remainder, those protons that have no heteronuclear couplings, which we refer to as the bulk, will make up around about 99% of the total proton magnetization pool. So the idea we can exploit here is that we can sample each of these different magnetization pools in an ideal scenario, whilst leaving all the other ones untouched and available for later acquisitions. So we could draw up a super sequence whereby in our first module, as we now call these separate experiments or elements, we might sample just those protons that have long-range correlations to carbon-13, so the brown ones shown here. Subsequent to that, we might sample the green protons, the 0.4% that correlate with M15, and so on through the sequence, the red for the HSQC and then the remaining bulk for the HOM nuclear cozy on the end. And the idea behind all these super sequences really is you sample just one pool of magnetization in any one module and retain as much as possible all other magnetization for sampling in the later modules in your sequence. And of course, in doing this, we only have the need for a single relaxation delay at the beginning where all our proton pools will recover and are then sampled sequentially through our super sequence following that. So it's a very modular design we're talking about here. We can, to a degree, swap around and interchange many of the sequences that we might wish to use. And this is an idea that we refer to as NOAA, NMR by ordered acquisition using 1H detection. And we published this about 5 years ago now. And it gives a lot of flexibility. So in this example, we would refer to this as being a NOAA 4 experiment. And we give each module a single letter code to allow us to identify them. So this would be BSCN, HMBC, HSQC, COSY, and NOSY. And you notice on the end of this, we have this COCO-NOSY element included here that's sampling the bulk magnetization in the last two modules, following that concept that we saw from 1984. And we can think of this operating in a sort of domino principle, that we start the experiment, we initiate the first acquisition, the first module, the output from that becomes the input for the next module, and so on in a sort of stepwise domino type fashion as we work through the sequence. So just going to look at a few examples of this and the type of data that we get out from it and the type of time savings that we can get. So we start with a very simple NOAA 2. This is HSQC and COSY, so NOAA 2 SC here. And in this, we're sampling two quite discrete pools of magnetization for the two modules here. We can collect those attached to carbon-13 HSQC and then the bulk that remains for the COSY. So we can collect a conventional experiment as two standard 2Ds, or we can collect it through the combined super sequence approach. And as we see in the data here, there's essentially no difference between the data sets that we get out here, but we've taken 50% of the time to collect the NOAA data sets versus the standalone data sets because of the reduction in the D1 delays that we require. We can extend that idea by adding further modules in. So we might need to introduce some modifications of modules for this sampling to work. And Eriks will talk a little bit about that in the next session. But we can see in this case, we have HMBC, HSQC, and COSY sampling the last of the bulk magnetization in this particular example. And on the right here, we see the data sets that we extract from the NOAA 3 experiment here. In this case, the data were put into a case program to elucidate the structure of this gibberellic acid, and the top rank structure that came out is indeed correct in this case. So it shows the quality of the data that comes out from the NOAA is good enough for a proper structure elucidation protocol. And the differences we see here, well, the standalone experiments we could collect in 45 minutes. For the same resolution, we could collect the NOAA data in just 20 minutes, so we're about halving the time again. Now, we have a lot of flexibility in this type of scheme, like I said. So this last module here basically samples a bulk magnetization that's left. And that means we can swap in a number of different modules and change around what we have in the end here. So we can go away from a standard magnitude mode COSY that we have in this example We can put in a double quantum filtered COSY, a clean in-phase COSY, a clip COSY. We can switch to TOXY. We can put dipolar correlations in, nosy-rosy, and some of the more slightly unusual 2D correlations, perhaps J-resolved experiments, or even pure shift experiments could go on the end here. All these sample the bulk magnetization, so we have this flexibility. I'll mention just briefly as well some of the work done by Kover and Sorensen. They've introduced what they refer to as a NORD experiment, a no relaxation delay NMR experiment. That follows a very similar principles to these supersequences. And essentially, for certain combination of appropriate modules, you can actually reduce the D1 delay down to 0 to give these no relaxation delay NMR experiments. But one might think of those as a subset of the whole supersequence approach. So here's just a few examples of NOAA-3 experiments where we've swapped around some of the last modules, and we've interchanged from a DQF COSY in one sequence to the clip COSY in another, to a TOXY in another, and a ROSY in the last one here. So these are just 4 different examples of NOAA where we've simply changed the last module in that case. So it just demonstrates the flexibility that we can get. But in each case, we've gone from about 15 to 20 minutes for the NOAA experiment relative to 40, 45 minutes for the 3 standalone experiments in these particular examples. So again, a significant time saving. This experiment illustrates a change in the last module, again, to something slightly different. So in this case, rather than collecting what is formally a 2D experiment, in this case, we're collecting on the end a Psyche pure shift experiment. So in this case, it's a triple spin echo Psyche. But these Psyche pure shift experiments are collected in a very similar way to 2Ds. Rather than collecting separate T1s, effectively collect different chunks of data in stages and stitch those back together to produce the 1D FID. But generally, we don't need so many chunks for these Psyche experiments. So we might collect 256 T1 increments in a standard 2D, for example, whereas we might only need 32 chunks for the pure shift experiment. But what that does mean is that we can actually use the additional time that we're saving in collecting fewer chunks by collecting more scans. So in this case, 16 scans per chunk for the Psyche versus 2 scans per increment for the 2 HSQC experiments. What that means is we can compensate for some of the sensitivity losses that are associated with these pure shift experiments by collecting more transients in that particular part of the supersequence. And we can see in this case, we have the 2 HSQCs, one for nitrogen, one for carbon-13, and then the pure shift proton spectrum that comes from the last module at the bottom. And just one final example here. So this is going back to the earlier example of the NOAA-4. This combines the carbon HMBC with the nitrogen HSQC, sensitivity enhanced version, in fact, in this case, carbon HSQC and the proton COSY. So in this, we're collecting those 4 separate pools of magnetization associated with those 4 separate isotopologs that exist within our sample. And we can see the final data sets that come out are very much like we'd expect to see from these standalone experiments, whereas these, of course, are the NOAA experiments. And in this case, we get about a factor of 3 in time saving from around about 20 minutes for the NOAA experiment versus about an hour for the 4 independent standalone experiments we would normally collect. So that's a sort of brief overview of a concept of what gives rise to the supersequences and the type of data that we get out. The target is always to collect equivalent data to the standalone experiments, but in a more time-efficient manner. So I'm going to finish with my sharing there. My intention really is to try and save as many questions as possible to the Q&A sessions at the end. If there are any particular relevant ones come up to any of the presentations, I might address those then. But I see there's some questions coming in the chat, and I think they're appropriate for us to leave to the Q&A at the end at the moment. So on that, I shall hand over to Eriks to do his presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, for excellent introduction to the NOAA Super-sequences. Let me take over here. First of all, I would like to dedicate this work to pay tribute to Professor Ray Freeman, with whom I have honor to collaborated for more than 20 years. Of course, Ray passed away on the 1st May of this year, but many of the ideas that we worked on, we have also exploited in this particular work. Now, Ray worked for 12 years at Varian Associates, and along with Wes Anderson and Richard Ernst. What a magnificent teams they had there. And Ray is also responsible for introducing me to Varian Associates at the time, which later became Varian Inc. So he organized my first trip to Varian in early 90s with Howard Hill receiving me at Varian. And so he's been really loyal to Varian all of his NMR life. And I have to say, once Agilent went out of business, Ray decided also that it's time for him to retire from NMR. I've been teaming up with Tim since then. And so let me get back to the NOAA sequences. I think probably it's fair to say that the idea has been in front of us for at least 100 years. And it's obvious if we wanted to transport these carriages separately one by one, it would take much longer time. It would be much more expensive, and it would keep our railways so much more busy. So obviously, putting them all together makes a lot of sense, and it's amazing that it only we only realized it a few years ago. Anyway, Tim already gave a short introduction, so I'm not stopping on explaining what NOAA sequences are. Just to say that from very beginning, we realized that we can build these sequences by combining several different techniques that are used for multi-feed detection. And so the rest of my presentation will be about what techniques we have exploited and how we can expand these super sequences using these techniques. Now, of course, that means we only use one recovery delay in these sequences. And if you can read this, you are definitely too close. We don't display pulse sequences or super sequences as pulse sequences. We only display so-called modules because they are modified standard experiments that are modified in such a way that we can put them together and form these super sequences. Now, basically the idea started really from ASAP HMQC, where we basically recycle bulk magnetization. We use short mixing time to speed up this acquisition. Of course, we can also use this bulk magnetization to record other experiments, such as COSY and HMBC and others. And as shown here. And so there are several ways how we can do this. I mean, we can record. It's basically based on 1J filters. So we use 1J magnetization to record HMQC and HSQC, and then we use a bulk to record either proton-proton correlated experiments, or we can use it also to record long-range correlations, long-range heteronuclear correlations. Or we can record different types of heteronuclear correlations, like 1J NH correlations and 1J CH correlations. So these are also easily to separate into different pools of magnetization. Now, it's often, we often mention that, of course, putting these things together has some effect on sensitivity, because pulse sequences are not perfect. You always lose a little bit of magnetization when you go to the next module. However, I want to draw your attention to the fact that if we record these super sequences for the same amount of time as it would take to record individual spectra individually, as in the conventional NMR, we actually gain sensitivity. So as you can see here, in each case, starting with NOAA2, which is in blue, NOAA3 in pink, and NOAA4 in red. In each case, we get actually sensitivity improvement. So in principle, NOAA sequences could also be used to improve sensitivity of if you have dilute samples and low sample concentrations. Now, the other technique that we involved, as Tim already mentioned, is this preservation of equivalent coherence pathways, or PEP principle, and that is most obvious in this COSY-NOSY combination, but there are also other combinations like COSY-ROSY, COSY-TOXY, and also the same principle can be used to record sequentially, for example, two TOXY experiments or two HSQC experiments, as shown by Knowles and Parel and as their co-workers. Okay, now once we combine these techniques, again, this was already mentioned by Tim, we can actually design super sequences for particular tasks. One of those is, for example, structuralization of small molecules. So basically, for that we need these three modules, which is HMBC, HSQC, and COSY. In simple cases, we can always use these three combinations to elucidate the structure of small molecules. And if you need more additional information, we can include other modules such as 15N, HMQC, for example, or HSQC, NOSY, ROSY, TOXY, and others. And of course, it's all about time saving and more efficient recording of multiple 2D data sets. Now, another technique that we have used is this multi-receiver NMR or parallel NMR. All commercial probes typically have at least two coils that can be multiply tuned to different nuclei. And so if you have multiple receivers, and we do this in all the modern consoles, you can record simultaneously FIDs from several nuclei. If you think about it, you actually record more signal from your sample in this way. So if these are, for example, high natural abundance nuclei like proton and fluorine and phosphorus, you actually also get more information in unit time and improves the sensitivity per unit time in this way. So here is just an example recorded on an advanced NEO system equipped with 4 receivers in 4 channels. We record here 3 spectra simultaneously. Okay, there is also some work done in biomolecular NMR with multiple receivers, and it makes actually more sense than in small molecules, particularly for carbon and nitrogen, because in biomolecules these nuclei are labeled. So there is not this big disparity of sensitivities between proton detected experiments and carbon or nitrogen detected experiments. There is still, of course, a difference that depends on the gammas, but at least these are then 100% labeled samples. Now, talking about multiple receivers, I would like to mention also the Panacea experiment, which in fact was the first or one of the first super sequences that was designed. We designed together with Ray Freeman. And that, of course, also gives plenty information for structure elucidation, because it gives carbon-carbon connectivities, carbon-proton, and then connects all the fragments using the HMBC correlations. Now, of course, inadequate is very low sensitivity experiment, but it runs throughout the experiment, whereas the other modules we switch between. You know, once we record HSQC with a couple of scans, we switch to HMBC, and inadequate is running all the time in the background, and as the same we do with M15 HSQC and M15 HMBC. So in this way, here we use 3 receivers, and so we record basically 10, 11 spectra in this Panacea experiment. Now, we have implemented multiple receiver modules also into NOAA sequences. So here is one example. So in this HSQC COSY, ROSY, and PANSY COSY example, magnetization is pretty much exhausted after the ROSY module. So we start with phosphorus here and transfer and record phosphorus correlation spectra, and also phosphorus proton, where magnetization goes from phosphorus to protons. So we start here with fresh phosphorus magnetization, and we don't need any recovery delay here. And so this phosphorus proton causes and connects proton-proton coupling networks with phosphorus-phosphorus coupling networks, and in fact gives us complete information about this molecule. Okay, now there are many other multi-receiver experiments or types of multi-receiver experiments that have not even been exploited for NOAA, and we only use a couple of them, and there is a review if you are interested. So, you know, you can correlate proton-proton or record simultaneously proton-proton, proton-fluorine, for example, proton-proton, proton-phosphorus. These are both high sensitivity nuclei. To some extent, carbon can be useful if there is a good sample concentration. Now, moving on, we can think about time-shared experiments. This is also a very popular technique, and in fact, it has a lot of similarity with multiple receiver experiments or with dual receiver experiments, except we have to phase encode here our 2 experiments, and typically or at least originally they were proton-carbon and proton-nitrogen HSQCs. Whereas, of course, in dual receiver experiments, we record these two spectra simultaneously. So you need 2 scans for the, or at least 2 scans for the time-shared experiments. And it turns out this also opens a new dimension into NOAA experiments. So as I said, the typical experiments that were recorded initially were HSQC based as a nitrogen and carbon. And later on, the technique was also used to record, for example, HSQC and HSQC COSY spectra simultaneously, or rather separate these cross peaks in this type of experiments. Now, we have used this for structuralization, and here we only need 2 modules to do that, because these 2 modules give us HMQC, constant time is multiplicity edited version of it, H2BC, and HMBC. So this is, again, sufficient information to extract structure of small molecules. And a similar experiment, in fact, was also independently designed by Ole Sorensen and his co-workers, with slightly different version of the two-bob sequence. Now, as our molecules become bigger, obviously we need more information to uncover the information that we need to obtain our structure in this case. And Professor Widmalm from Stockholm University contacted us and asked whether we could design a super sequence where, which would record 5 of these spectra that he would then feed into this Casper program to obtain structure of oligosaccharides. Okay, it was quite straightforward to design the NOAA 4 sequence with 4 modules that we required, that he required, but then we could in fact do all 5 by using this time-shared experiment here. And here we show it as a parallel module, because these 2 are recorded simultaneously, so rather than sequentially. So we show it as a parallel module here. And so with these 5 spectra, you know, it becomes kind of a black box experiment. You know, you can push a button on your spectrometer and it will record these 5 spectra using this NOAA Casper super sequence. And then we feed it into the Casper structure oxidation program, and it gives us structure of this oligosaccharide and simulated spectra. So with a high degree of confidence from the provided spectra. Now we can further expand this parallel detection using time-shared modules. So here we also add IPAP, which is in-phase and anti-phase HSQCs that are recorded in time-shared manner. So with time-shared experiments, we can actually have many additional options. We can record the non-shared experiments with twice as many scans, or we can record them with double resolution, because we need 2 scans for these time-shared experiments, whereas for non-time-shared experiments, we can choose to double the resolution. And we can record these experiments with 2 different parameters, like 2 different mixing times or 2 different J couplings. For example, these HMBC modules, they're each recorded with a different J coupling setting. And finally, we can also use completely different module for the second increments that is needed for time-shared experiments. So we can, in one of the chains, we record Corsi-Rosi combination. In the alternate experiment, we record two sequential toxic experiments. So this gives us, in a sense, two parallel supersequences that are recorded in the same experiment. And so we get 10 spectra out of this in 18 minutes, 18 and a half. Conventional experiment would take 1 hour, 1.5 hours. So considerable time saving here. And in fact, we can record all these spectra with a single scan per increment in just 9 minutes. So we get 10 spectra in 9 minutes here. And here is another example where HMBC is recorded with double resolution, just to illustrate the fact that I mentioned, that we can also use the non-time-shared modules with double resolution. So this would be NOAA 9. And this particular region is very crowded, so it makes sense to record HMBC with double resolution in this particular case. So it just shows how much flexibility we really have in designing these supersequences. Now, this brings me to conclusions. So, as I said, we have used different techniques, time sharing, polarization sharing, which I didn't talk much about, but it's pretty straightforward. Isotope filtering, use of multiple receivers, the PEP principles, and so on. So, effectively, any techniques that is used for multi-feed detection can also be incorporated into these supersequences. Now we can tailor these supersequences for specific tasks, such as metabolomics research, and Alex will talk about it in more detail. Structural elucidation of small organic molecules, reaction monitoring, and similar. And so this reduces time that we need to record these spectra, and can also be used to improve the sensitivity. And finally, it also improves consistency of all the spectra that we record. And 2 or more supersequences can be assembled in parallel using these time-shared techniques, so we can record up to 10 spectra. In fact, we can record even more, as the more recent versions of topspin allow recording more than 5 spectra in these supersequences, which was one of the limiting factors so far, but no more. And so that brings me to the end of the talk. So we have written a few reviews here. And let me also thank my collaborators that I had the honor to work with. And let me pass on this to the next speaker, which is John, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks, Eriks. I'll just come in there quickly. So there's been a number of questions coming in, most of which I think we can probably keep till the end. There have been a few asking about availability of the sequences and what software is needed for processing of data. And these are some of the topics that will be addressed in John's talk coming up next. So I think we'll let John speak and then come back to these afterwards as necessary. So John.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Tim, and thanks, Eriks, for right. So my talk is going to be far more on the practical side of how do you run these supersequences and how do you process the data, which is, I mean, pretty much all you need to. actually to use these. And then at the end, I'll talk a bit about the implementation of non-uniform sampling, or NUS, within these super sequences, which it provides basically an even greater time savings on top of the concatenation of modules itself. And throughout this whole talk, a lot of this stuff centers on this website which I've made called Genesis. And I'm just going to bring it over here. So this is a website which would let you first create pulse programs. So that's its main job, really. And in here you see a list of possible modules, which Tim and Eriks have both talked about. And you can just pick whichever ones you like. So to say we want to run an HMBC, carbon HSQC, and then close, for example, and then that will give you this pulse program, which can be directly used on the spectrometers. So if you download this file, it will give you a file, and then you just bring it over to the spectrometer and run it, which I'm going to describe now exactly how you run that. So step one is download the pulse programs. You put it in the appropriate directory in Topspin, and then the parameter setup is really the only tricky thing in this. So what you need to do is to set it up such that your open this node data set. So here we've got a node 2 experiment set up. It's a HSQC followed by a TOXI. So each of these have sort of one-letter abbreviations, as Tim alluded to. So when you look at this, it's actually set up as any standard 2D experiment with a couple of tiny changes. So you need to set it up as a proton-carbon experiment. We always have carbon in the indirect dimension. If you're using, for example, COSY, this will be automatically calculated in the pulse program. So it will use this value instead of this value for the indirect dimension. In the setup here, you need to make sure that first nucleus is proton, second nucleus is carbon, and if you have nitrogen, it goes in the third nucleus. Now, the easiest way to do this is basically to take any HSQC parameter set, load it in, and go from there. So because that will set everything up correctly in terms of the frequency channels. But there are two things that are different compared to a standard 2D experiment. One is NBL, this parameter which you can only see here, which you see here if you go into the experiment parameter modification screen. So this needs to correspond to the number of modules that you are concatenating. So in this case, because we've got an HSQC followed by a TOXI, that's 2. And if you're ever in doubt about this, if you look at the pulse program at the top of it, it will say set NBL topspin parameter to 2. And the other parameter that needs to be changed is TD1. So here, the number of T1 increments in the indirect dimension needs to be its original number times NBL. So in this case, if we want to have HSQC and TOXI with 256 indirect dimension increments, we would need to put 512 here. This is basically an oddity topspin, which arises because this number specifies how much data is to be collected. So because we're recording 2 modules with 256 increments each, this needs to be 512. And then once that's done, if you go into the experiment parameters again, then you can see all of these sequence parameters are quite thoroughly described. So, and generally they correspond to the same thing that you would have in a standard library sequence. So constant 2, for example, is the value which controls the delays in an inept, for example. And you want to set this to be a sort of compromised 1-bond carbon proton coupling. D1, this is a TOXI mixing time. So all of these really follow from the standard library experiments. If we scroll down, there are a bunch of shaped pulses as well as gradients. And the pulse programs that you can download from the Genesis website are made to be as easy to use as possible. So here you can just type GPPP and these gradient values will all be populated correctly. So GPPP. It won't change anything because they're already set up correctly. But if you if you're starting from nothing, then that command will populate everything correctly. And shape pulses can all be generated using WaveMaker, which is a piece of software that's inside TopSpin and lets you generate shaped pulses on the fly according to the needs of your pulse program. So I'm not going to do it now, and I don't actually have a sample of the machine because I only got on the machine at 4 and I wanted to listen to 10 Eriks. So we just have to use data that I've already acquired. So once you've done all of this, it's just standard parameter setup, but you change two special parameters, NBL and TD1. Then you can just acquire as usual. You just lock, shim, tune, and adjust the receiver gain. And I should mention with the receiver gain that if you use the auto receiver gain adjustment with RGA, it will give you probably a number that's too big, because what it does is it records the FID from the first module, which in this case is HSQC, and it will adjust the receiver gain for that module. And the problem is that if you use that value of RG for the toxi, it will probably overflow. And to get around that, what you can do is to run a simple proton experiment, do RGA on that, and then copy the value of RG back to this one so that you make sure you don't get any ABC overflows. So in this case, I think it is set to something sensible like 64. So if you were to do RGA, it will give you a number that's far larger than this. So yeah, generally try to avoid that. And then after that, you just acquire it. It's not very hard to set these things up and get them going the first time. So if you just type ZG, you will get data, and then, which I've already gotten here. So this is an old data set. And which brings us to the processing part. So processing is all completely automated, with the caveat that you need to get a bunch of processing scripts. So I will say that a lot of these processing scripts are included in TopSpin, but if you want to get the super recent, most latest and greatest versions, then you can download them from the website again. And if you see, just below the module selector, we've got download pulse programs, but there's also download processing scripts. So if you click that, you'll get the newest version of the scripts. And generally, these will contain bug fixes, slight improvements to functionality and things like that. So if you have issues with this, sometimes one of the easiest things to do is to just download the newest versions and check whether you still have an issue. And then once the experiment's done, you can do split X AU. So you just need to run this AU program. Go, and then what it'll do is it will create 2 new experiments. So if you see here, we've got experiment number 2. This is the NOAA data set that you acquired. What it's going to do is to generate 2 new data sets, 2001 and 2002, which are the processed data sets. And as you might imagine, 2001 is the HSQC, and 2002 is the toxi. Well, you need to phase as usual. It doesn't do that for you. Well, it tries to do that for you, but not necessarily correctly. So at this point, these are all standard, completely standard 2D data sets, which you can process or analyze as normal as you would for any other 2D data set. So that's really it. Behind the scenes, what SplitX AU does is, firstly, it needs to separate the 2 modules, the data from the 2 modules. So it copies the first half of the data into 2001 and the second half of the data into 2002. And then what it does is it needs to process these in the correct manner. Because, for example, if you try to process an HSQC experiment, like a COSY experiment, you're probably going to get something that's not looking very nice. So in the old days, you needed to set some processing parameters. You needed to go into the processing parameters here, and then at the bottom, set user P1 through user P5. So you needed to call this NOAA HSQC, for example, and then you needed to call this NOAA toxi states or something like that. And what that does is it instructs SplitX AU to process the first dataset like an HSQC and the second dataset like a toxi. Nowadays, you don't need to do that. If you download the pulse programs from the website, this is all automatically done for you behind the scenes, because in the pulse program at the very bottom, I should go back to HSQC and TOPSy. At the very bottom, it tells you that it encodes this information in the pulse program basically, so you don't even need to do that. Yeah, so that's actually all it is. Processing is done with one EU program, and it's completely behind the scenes. Everything's done for you. Yeah, so all you need to do to set multiple experiments up, you see, if you see 101, 102, 103 here, these are a series of increasingly complex NOAA experiments. And in the first one, we've got the HSQC plus TOPSy, which is the same one as the one that I just processed. So you need to change this value as well as NBL every time you go from one experiment to another. So in a NOAA 3 experiment where we've got HMBC, HSQC, and a TOPSy, then you need to change this to 256 times 3, for example, if you wanted each of the 3 modules to have 261 increments. And you also need to change NBL this to 3. And just to prove, just to drive home the point about time savings, if you look at this experiment, the NOAA 2 experiment takes about 17 minutes to run. The NOAA 3 experiment doesn't take much more time to run. It's going to take about 18 minutes because it's got a slightly longer time because you've added the HMBC, which includes acquisition as well as J-evolution delays and things like that. But broadly speaking, the time is still the same. And in this amount of time, you're getting 3 spectra instead of 2. So if you go to a NOAA 4, again, you need to set this TD1 to 4 times 256, set NBL to 4, and you see that the experimental time is also not changed by very much. So yeah, so you can combine up to 5 modules right now because the limit on NBL in TopSpin so far is 5, although I think there are works in progress that will expand that to larger numbers, which will mean that we can make even longer supersequences. Okay, and then lastly, I'll just talk on NUS. So NUS in NOAA experiments is implemented in a slightly different way from conventional experiments. So in a traditional 2D NMR, you would go into here, change function type to non-uniform sampling, and change NUS amount and things like that. But here, you don't want to do this. So firstly, you need to get the NUS script. So if you go back again to the website, in this processing scripts, what you're going to find is, let me open the version that I just downloaded from you. Yeah, so this is the zip file of processing scripts. If you unzip it, you'll find AU, which are the processing AU scripts, including SplitX AU just now. And then there are Python scripts, or in fact, just one Python script, which is the NUS script. So if you install that into TopSpin, put it in the correct directory, and then set up your experiment just as usual. So following exactly the same procedure as was on my earlier slide. Now, once you have this, we just check the experiment time. This is about 17 minutes. So let's say we want to apply 50% NUS, right? So what you need to do is to change the NUS amount parameter. So it's under acquisition parameters followed by NUS. So if you want 25%, you can put 25%, let's say 50% for now, right? So you can either change this or this. They're both interconnected. I should have put TB here. Sorry, it's NUS points. So either this one, the percentage, or the number of T1 increments you want. Right, and once you've done that, don't change this. What you want to do is to run the Python script that you just downloaded. So if you do NOAA_NUS2 space on, so turn on NUS, then it will give you this dialog box, which should mean that you have correctly set up NUS. So it says that your NUS percentage has been set to 50%. Originally, without NUS, we had 250 T1 increments per module. And now with NUS, you've got 128 T1 increments per module. And if you run that, it will change a bunch of parameters behind the scenes, but you don't need to worry about that as long as you stick to the script. So if you check the experiment time right now, it's going to say the experiment time has been halved. So as you would expect with 50% NUS. Now, if you want to go back to the uniformly sampled experiment, all you need to do is to do no_NUS2 off. And you'll be greeted with another dialog box which says that it's been successfully disabled and it's returned your T1 increments per module to 256. Yeah, so once you've done, NUS2 on, you just acquire just ZG and then process it as usual. So it will split the data, perform the NUS reconstruction, and then process each of the individual spectra. And that's pretty much all I have. But if you have more questions about this, then what you can do is to, again, go to the website, and then there's an FAQ here, which you can access either by reading the FAQ or just scrolling down, really. So if you scroll down, there's, right, there we go. There's lots and lots of information about how to run these experiments. So these are just basically exactly the same thing as what I've just discussed. It tells you how to use NUS. It tells you how to use solvent suppression. It shows you, it warns you that RGA does not work as expected. And then there's processing stuff, and then there's lots of information, really. So if you have any questions, the first port of call should be this. And then if not, you feel free to drop us an email with, yeah, we're more than happy to answer questions about setting it up or processing it or just any problems you might have. Yeah, so I think that's the end of my section, and I'll pass it on to Alex, who will be talking about his usage of noise supersequences in metabolomics. So it's something completely different from what Tim and Eriks and I have been doing, but it's really good to see that there's applicability in really areas that we're not focusing on as well. So Alex.
You'll have to stop share first.
Yes, I do.
Thanks, John. While you guys switch over, just to pick up on a couple of quick points that have come up in the chat. There's a few questions about setting of FN mode, which Alex has answered there. But essentially, everything is run with one FM mode. Generally, that's echo anti-echo. And anything other than that is always hard-coded into the Pulse program, if it's different. And the AU programs that are run like NOAA_HSQC or NOAA_CODI, whatever, will take care of any changes that are needed for the particular experiments themselves and correct the FN mode at the processing stage. So all of that is taken care of, and there's only one setting needed for that. There's also mention of Bruker packages. There are a certain number of NOAA experiments in the Bruker packages. They tend to be somewhat behind what we would call the current state-of-the-art versions that we have. So they do exist and they definitely should work, but you'll find a greater variety on the website that John just presented then. Okay, so I think we'll leave the other questions for later and I'll hand over to Alex.
All right, thank you very much. Can you still hear me all right?
Yep.
It's fine.
Okay, so yeah, I got into this some time ago, looking at how we can improve metabolomics, and we've since tried to find new ways to apply NOAA and supersequence technology to biomolecules. And so to just get started, let me grab a laser pointer. All right, so if you're mostly chemists, you may not be 100% aware of what metabolomics exactly is, but it's the identification and quantification of metabolites in usually biological fluids when it comes to NMR. It could be cells, tissues, etc. But then NMR, we like our solution state. And the real goals of this would be to identify biomarkers in these samples that could be indicative of disease and in principle develop accurate diagnostic tests. So what does this look like? So here we have a 1D proton NMR spectrum of mouse urine. recorded at 850 megahertz in a TCI cryoprobe. And as you can see, it's quite complex, right? But as we are all very familiar with, the advantages of NMR are that it's highly reproducible, non-destructive. Every one of these peaks has atomic structural information in it. It's quantitative, but as you can see, these mixtures are really complex. And in addition, we have, hopefully also see that we have an enormous dynamic range, right? There are going to be some metabolites that have huge concentrations, maybe upwards of what Tim and Eriks were showing before in the 10 to 50 millimolar range. But more often than not, we're looking at micromolar quantities of molecules. So in our hands, we prefer to work with an HSQC, right? A lot of that overlap gets removed. But as you can see, this is run on, I think this is the same mouse urine sample recorded, but our HSQCs will tend to run for on the order of like 8 hours as opposed to 20 minutes. Okay, I saw my screen was frozen, so I wanted to make sure. We've worked on improving metabolomics research, work using these HSPCs for quite some time. And over the years, my boss, Raphael Bruschweiler, has developed these web servers called COMAR, so the complex mixture analysis by NMR, and more recently, we've developed these deep neural network peak pickers that are able to better identify and quantify these overlapped regions, right? So normal peak pickers have very difficult time at identifying overlapping signals, but this is trained specifically to find those. And then with the combination of all these tools, it's now becoming possible to just do combined analysis of multiple HSQCs to then identify those compounds and metabolites that are changing significantly from one cohort to another. And a recent example of this is here in Frontiers in Cell Infectious Microbiology, where Abby was able to identify some interesting pathway differences for biofilms. So if you want to go check that out or search. But that's really sort of the incredible goal that we want to do with NMR. So with all of these tools that have been developed, we have a sort of semi-automated analysis of 2D spectra, which is less time consuming and less tedious. The peak pickers improve the number of metabolites. It's really streamlined and made the protocol very robust and more consistent, and removing some of the sort of lab to lab variability depending on the expertise of the user. And so the analysis of these large cohorts is now possible and in a sort of time efficient manner. However, data acquisition now starts to become our bottleneck, right? Each one, like I said, each of these 2Ds that we record for metabolomics purposes are on the order of hours and not the minutes it would take for 1D analysis. And for statistical analysis, we want to run ideally dozens of these samples. And in large part, and some people make use of this, non-uniform sampling methods to speed up the acquisition is not really appropriate because the artifacts that can result from NUS reconstruction generally rival those of the low concentration metabolites that we actually want to look at. So it's not really in our hands has not been a useful approach. And then in addition, I've only shown the HSQC, but our workhorse experiments for our lab is HSQC, the sensitivity enhanced HSQC, Toxi, and then HSQC Toxi. So the Toxis in particular help to build up the spin systems, right? And really confirm, right? We have it helps you to identify which compound or which peaks are actually part of the same molecule, which really improves the identification, right? Most of the identification happens just on the HSQC, which does this peak match something in a molecule, but you want to sort of confirm that with multiple peaks if possible, and that's what you get from the Toxi and HSQC Toxi. But again, the HSQC itself is 8 hours. HSQC Toxi is even less sensitive, so that would be half a day. And a Toxi is not that bad since it's homonuclear. So the whole suite of things would be about a day's worth of experiments. And obviously, I mean, this is what Abby was able to do, but if we can improve that, it would be incredibly useful. So at the time I started working on this, the only HSQC that was implemented in NOAA was sort of your standard HSQC. But like I said, we want the sensitivity enhanced HSQC. And there was this element that Eriks has been using for these ZZ HMBCs. And I thought maybe that would be a good starting point for working on how to implement the sensitivity enhanced HSQC. And the reason, so what I was able to find, and with just a little bit of modification of the phase cycling, is that this, what I call a zip element, actually works like an isotope selective pulse, right? So if you look at protons bound to carbon-12, which is our bulk magnetization, this little element transfers the signal from Z to HX, and then through the rest of the pulse sequence, it ends up on HZ. And I've left out signs. That's for the detailed analysis. But we can adjust the phases just to make sure that at the end of the experiment, the signal is HZ. And that's because, in large part, the sensitivity enhanced transfer at the end here transfers magnetization from Z to Z and from X to X and from Y to Y. So as long as I was able to get magnetization to be Z during this T1 element, which has additional benefits, then I would be able to record my experiment. So this is good. And if we look at what happens for the carbon labeled signals, right, they actually transfer through this one bond coupling. And in the HMBC, this is used to actually filter out those signals, whereas here those are the ones we want to observe. And then the HSQC proceeds as normal, and because we're doing sensitivity enhanced, we are doing this preservation of equivalent pathways. So we collect our HX and HY in the echo-anti-echo fashion. And so we have the best of both worlds. So at this point, you can proceed and combine this experiment with NOAA. And Tim has also investigated the sensitivity enhanced HSQC has had similar success. And so here is just a model mixture that we would use, and we used modest concentrations. So we ran this experiment for a few hours, and we have two versions of this. One where it's zip HSQC and followed by a Toxi, and another word, zip HSQC toxy, followed by a toxy. And in both of these steps, we have 80 milliseconds of toxy mixing. And so on the left, we have the no. Hopefully, what you don't see is that this is actually an overlay of the NOAA sequence in blue with sort of traditional sequences in black, and you can see they're perfectly overlapped. On the left, we have the what we call NOAA 2 Colmar HSQC toxy, and on the right is the HSQC toxy. And they work very well. The sensitivities are on par with what the standalones acquire. So we don't really have any loss in sensitivity by running NOAA for these metabolite samples. And if you look here on the NOAA 2 Colmar, the HSQC and toxy, these are the volumes of the signals in the toxy experiment. And you can see it's really perfectly correlated. Now, when we run the HSQC toxy plus toxy, you get a little mixing of that bulk magnetization. And so you get, relative to a standalone toxy, you get some more variation in your intensities. But that's just comparing two different experiments, basically, right? The standalone versus the NOAA toxy. And so this is not unexpected. And again, the correlation is still quite good. And if I were to run NOAA 2 Colmar twice in a row, it wouldn't look like this. It would be more like the one on the left, right? So the reproducibility for our samples is on the order of 7% here, which is basically the variation between repeats. And whereas the variation relative to the reference experiment is around 10 or 20%. Again, because you are still applying pulses, but that scrambled the bulk magnetization a little bit, but it is completely reproducible. So applying that NOAA Colmar experiment to a urine sample now, instead of just the single HSQC that we have here, we have both experiments, the HSQC and the toxy at the same time in about 9 hours. And what I would like to highlight, because there was one question about water suppression, and hopefully you can see, so our samples are our samples are usually lyophilized and resuspended in D2O, but that's not always the case. It could be a higher water content, but these experiments do suppress water quite well. The other nice thing, which was a bit unexpected, is that the NOAA toxy that comes at the end is actually a lot cleaner, right? So in the standalone toxy, we would get a lot of, again, we have this huge dynamic range that we're trying to deal with, but some of these incredibly strong signals end up with a lot of phase distortions and T1 noise. Whereas in the NOAA, for some reason, the mixing running it simultaneously with the HSQC helps mitigate that to a large extent. So again, improving the quantification even further. Now, for fun, we thought, would it be possible to extend this to all 3 experiments? And so making use of the ASAP mixing concept that Eriks was talking about, we put together a couple of NOAA 3 Colmar experiments. The first one, where you have the zip HSQC, and again, that leaves the bulk magnetization along Z, and then you can do ASAP to try to mix that back to those C13 labeled protons, which is a weird statement, but and then try to run the zip HSQC toxi, which again preserves the Z magnetization, and then run the toxi. Or we can flip that and start with HSQC toxi. And then advantage here, though, is that the toxi mixing, so the toxi mixing time actually acts as the ASAP mixing time. So we don't have to add anything to this experiment before proceeding with the HSQC and then finally the toxi. And as one might expect, since these are basically using the same magnetization, same spins, the second experiment here is dramatically affected and has enormous variation compared to a standalone sequence. However, the first and last experiments are still equivalent to the standalone sequences. So in terms of quantification, it's the first and last experiments in our hands work perfectly well, but we can have a huge time savings. So this third experiment, even though it's maybe less optimal, is effectively free. And in the world of metabolomics, anything we can get that can benefit our identifications is worth it. So that's where I wanted to leave off with the metabolomics piece. And again, just sort of highlighting that now with NOAA, we can acquire in similar or less time, a more in the same amount of time it would have acquired the HSQCs by themselves, we can acquire full sets of data for an entire cohort, which will invariably improve the identification and accuracy of these techniques. So moving on to a more recent application, we were interested in how we can actually apply these types of ideas to biomolecules. And Eriks touched on a couple of efforts that he's had in the past, but we have some other ideas that we wanted to try out. So the challenge here is in biomolecules, we generally will do uniform isotope labeling. And it wasn't really addressed in the previous talks, but a lot of the advantages of NOAA come from the fact that you're actually using natural abundance signals, right? You're running an HSQC, which only uses up 1% of your protons. And then you can run an HSQC on a different nucleus, which also is only another 1% of your protons, and leaving your bulk magnetization behind to run your COSIs and NOSIs. Here, again, if we're 100% carbon labeled, then that leaves nothing for further experiments. So that's one challenge. Also, our protons are not horribly well dispersed. The aliphatics are in a pretty narrow range, so we aren't very able to look at one proton spin system and then move on to another. And I would just say that 2D spectra are already quite quick. Again, we're uniformly labeled. We're okay with a 10 or 15 minute HSQC. And there are a lot of techniques like BEST and SOFAST to acquire spectra, simple 2D spectra in very short order. So what we would be more interested in is addressing some of the very long experiments that are in biomolecular NMR. And the way we can maybe go about that is we know like the heteronuclear chemical shifts are very well known in biomolecules. And they're also very distinct. We have a lot of shape pulses at our availability for carbons so we can select one carbon over another. And again, there are a lot of very long bio-NMR experiments that maybe we can chain together. And if anybody knows me, my bread and butter is dynamics. So obviously molecules move, and for any biological process, there is probably an NMR experiment that can look at it. And the ones I'm going to focus on here is a newer class of experiment called CEST, and through the relaxation dispersion, and through the analysis of these experiments, we can actually extract chemical shifts and other things from excited states of low populated states of these proteins, and hopefully again get information on the structure and nature of those excited states. So in the CEST experiment, sort of getting long-winded, but in the CEST experiment, what we have is we prepare some carbon or nitrogen magnetization along Z, and we just apply a very weak saturation field. And then we will move that saturation field one step at a time to build up a profile, which I will sort of describe here. So we'll start with the saturation field very far off resonance and record an entire HSQC. So maybe each one of these points will be about 30 minutes, let's imagine. Then we will record more and more HSQCs while we vary that B1 field. And when we cross over our peak of interest or one of our signals, then you'll saturate that peak and you get this dip. Now, what you can't really see here is that this is actually undergoing exchange, and under many time regimes or at low populations, this is effectively invisible to the NMR. And so, however, by running a CEST experiment, when we cross over that peak, because it's exchanging with our main peak that we're observing, we get a saturation of this signal. And we can use these, all of these data and analyze them, and we can extract a wide range of information from fast timescale motions to the change in the chemical shifts, which again is related to the structure of that excited state, the exchange rates and populations. So structure, thermodynamics, kinetics, we get from one of these experiments. And at this point, there are CEST experiments for virtually every nucleus in the protein that we want, from carbonyls to side chains, and obviously amides and J couplings. And it conveniently only requires a single carbon labeled sample, carbon double labeled protein sample. So as I've been alluding to, though, however, these experiments are incredibly long, right? We will record on the order of 100 offsets per B1 field. So our experiments can easily be upwards of 2 days. And most people will only end up looking at the amide backbone nitrogen because, again, every other nucleus you look at would be another 2 to 3 days worth of experiments. So what about NOAA? So like I said, uniform labeling prevents us from observing the same nucleus. So maybe one idea would be, can we record all of the offsets in a NOAA fashion and save time that way? Unfortunately, that's not really possible because, again, it's uniformly labeled. Once we've recorded the nitrogen, we can't really record it again. You might think, well, let's use selective pulses here, but generally proton shaped pulses are still not quite good enough to be as selective as we want. Also, there's strong decoupling on the proton channel here, so that's going to crush all of our proton signals by the end of this experiment anyways. And so the thought we had was, after our first experiment, why don't we just start on carbon? So we would theoretically do something like this. We would have our nitrogen CEST, have our acquisition, and immediately go into a carbon CEST, where we would start on the carbon nucleus. The most common of these experiments that people are interested in are the methyl side chains. So traditionally, what we would do is we would transfer from proton magnetization down to in-phase carbon magnetization, right? If you have any proton two-spin order, then that decoupling is going to completely kill your signal. Unfortunately, for methyl groups, this is only about 38% efficient because it's a double inept of sorts. And so comparing that to if we just start with carbon, that's about 25%. So we kind of expect about a 35% sensitivity loss at the front due to starting on carbon instead of proton. And so this is what we were able to come up with. And a couple of important points, right? So now we're uniformly C13 labeled. So we do have some carbon pulses here, but these are broadband adiabatic pulses. And if you repeat them twice, then your carbon magnetization that you want to use just gets flipped back to Z in very short order. We do have some saturation here so that, again, every scan, we start from the same point before we run D1. And so if we look at the first experiment, we're above 90% as usual in NOAA. The first experiment is always almost identical to a standalone experiment. But what we didn't quite expect is we only had maybe about a 10% loss in the NOAA carbon CEST experiment compared to the standalone proton start experiment. And our rationalization for that is that these mixing times are several hundred milliseconds long, and we're doing this strong proton decoupling during it. And this is actually building up some sort of heteronuclear NOE enhancement to improve the signal of our carbons. And as long as we include this heat compensation so that the amount of this decoupling is always happening for every scan, then it works very quantitatively and reproducibly. And we were able to confirm that in the second experiment where we simply put that heat compensation block before a carbon start CEST, and we got, again, the same sensitivity. Whereas if we didn't have that, that heat compensation, we did lose our magnetization. And then what we were hoping to find is, again, we get our about 40 to 50% time saving. So again, recording the carbon CEST for about the same time as it would take a single CEST experiment. And then you might ask, well, okay, these are quantitative experiments. Well, how does the data look? And you can see here in red and blue are the standalone and NOAA recorded CEST experiments. And I will honestly tell you, I don't know which one is which, but I hope that doesn't matter. Obviously, they're basically the same. And if we put this through the full analysis of where we want to look at delta omegas or extract the R1 or R2, the standalone on the x-axis versus NOAA in the right, we're getting the same parameters for both the nitrogen here on the left and the carbon on the right. So in summary, now we're applying some new tricks, I guess. We are able to record both of these experiments in the amount of time that it takes to record one. And we're doing it quantitatively and at much less loss than we had initially expected due to some NOE enhancement that's going on. These can be easily sort of combined with other techniques, such as NUS, or there are other speed up approaches for CEST experiments. We have not yet implemented NUS like John was showing, but it is in principle possible. And then recapping what we were doing on NOAA Colmar, using NOAA in the metabolomic sense is incredibly useful and powerful, and without any loss of sensitivity to our spectra or our analysis. And so with that, just sort of acknowledging, again, Rodrigo down here, who was working on the biomolecular side. And I have to throw in my plug for the Gateway National Ultra High Field NMR facility here in the US. where we will, in the next year, be getting our first 1.2 gigahertz. So if you have ideas for what you might want to use that for, please reach out. And that's it from my side.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Some really nice applications there of a slightly different area from our usual regime. It's really nice to see. So we have a bit of time now for the Q&A sessions. And there are a few questions that have come up in the chat I see here. I'll start with a quick response to some that relate to hardware. Essentially, for the standard NOAA sequences, you don't need any special hardware. So if you're doing just HC experiments, then a standard two-channel instrument will be fine. If you want to include nitrogen, obviously you need something like a triple resonance probe at least to be able to do those, but there's no other requirements beyond that. And someone was asking about running them on cryoprobes. Not a problem. If you can do that, it's even better. That's the best way to collect these sequences with high sensitivity if possible. But we do a lot of work on cryoprobes and that's never been a problem. So, and I'm guessing the same is for Alex's use of cryoprobes as well.
Yeah, my NOAA 3 Colmar has roughly 200 milliseconds of like 10 kilohertz proton toxies going on. So yeah, no problem whatsoever. I might increase D1 to 1.5 instead of 1, but it's fine. The bigger problem with those is having the 2 carbon decoupling periods. We try to record our acquisitions of about 200 milliseconds to get as much resolution as possible. So that's a little bit more sketchy, but if you're watching your cryoprobe parameters, it doesn't drop more than a few percent. So it's fine.
Sure. And there was a question that came in about water suppression, which has been touched on briefly as well. Alex mentioned the ability of the sequences to be inherently good at water suppression. A lot of this, we've looked at this a bit on some of the sequences we've got. I don't know, John, if you want to say a bit about water suppression options are available, because you've looked into this, and we do have some of those built into the options on a lot of the Genesis Pulse programs.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I can do one better and show some data. I was looking it up
yeah,
when I saw the question. So this is again, so in many of the like HSQC type experiments, you don't need additional water suppression because water is part of the bulk magnetization that will be returned to the z-axis at the end of the experiment. So you don't need to do anything extra for those, but for the homonuclear experiments, it helps to just chuck in any kind of water suppression. So we have, if you download the Pulse programs from Genesis, there is preset, there is excitation stopping at the end of the experiment. And this gives you generally a pretty good data. It's not processed. This is because it's from last year. So I will process it. So this is the HSQC of an aqueous sucrose sample, if I'm not wrong. And the toxin needs to be phased, but you can see that this water peak is not too problematic. So generally the performance is decent, I'd say, at least decent. Pretty good.
Yeah, and I would say we always use the excitation sculpting, zero quantum suppression sequence in our hands also.
Yeah, sure. And there was a question that came in from Isvan. I don't know if Isvan's still on the meeting and wants to talk to his question about different delays being implied in the parallel experiments. No. Okay, maybe not present.
Ishwan is, I think, is still in there. Ishwan, you could unmute yourself. And
I'm here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
and I exist in real life as well. So I'm sorry I missed the question because I was typing another one.
Okay, all right. It was your earlier question about different delays being applied in the...
Oh, yes, yes. There were parallel experiments for Kupce and so on. And what happens, it was the HMBC in parallel. You mentioned that the delays could be adjusted for different J's, but that changes the length of the overall length of the individual pulse sequences. Is it compensated in the end in non-equal acquisition times between the segments, or how it is handled?
You're muted, Eriks. Eriks, you're muted.
Yes, there is slight differences, but it didn't really make any impact on the spectra,
I don't expect that whatsoever. I understand the acquisition time is much.
Oh, we didn't do much about it, to be honest. You know, it worked just fine, and so.
All right, that's the easiest solution.
That is not broken.
Thanks. Good to see you anyway.
Yeah, good to see you too.
And you had a question about was it editing of sequences?
Oh, my question was about FN mode, because different experiments operate with different FM modes. And as I understand, there is only one setting for the whole sequence. And then I received response.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, you do set one FM mode at the beginning. And like I said, it's generally echo, anti-echo for most things. There are a few modules that use different samplings, the states we use sometimes.
Right.
And hard encoded, all the phase steps needed are hard encoded into Pulse program. And then when it gets to the processing stage, the AU script, you tell it what quantity detection mode has been used for the experiment, and that is handled directly in the processing script for you automatically.
So the actual acquisition practically ignores the FN mode, is it correct to say?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Generally,
own protocol.
Yeah, the FN mode is really only used during the processing, right? It tells topspin, okay, this is echo, anti-echo, so I need to phase something and add them and subtract them and so on and so forth. So how you record the data in the SIR file has really no effect on, or it's not affected by FN mode, right? So you can have something in echo, you can have something in QF. I mean, you can have something in states. It doesn't make any difference. And so when it's split apart, that parameter in the ACQUS file gets changed depending on what it's actually supposed to be, and then Topspin handles it normally.
So before I sneak in my last question, which I typed in, but now I have the opportunity to ask, I just wanted to say thanks for this fantastic collection of talks. It was very informative and very, very useful. My last question was, is there a chance, or how difficult it is to home notch or home change pulse sequences, or sneak in another one or a variety of something? How much hardwired is the genesis is absolutely overwhelmingly fantastic. So let's put it this, that's the first thing I would say. But even then, if you would have an idea to do something different, or add such as 1D nosy type of water suppression to sequences and so on, is it hard to make changes?
John, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, the power sequences are, I mean, standard Bruker power sequences, so you can just read them and edit them. It's not too hard to add in extra power sequence elements. I think what might be tricky is if you were to add new modules and then you want all the processing bells and whistles to work correctly, then that might require some adjustment to some of the things which are not really fully explained. But if you just want to change, like add water suppression or something, that's totally possible, and no doubt you'll be able to.
I have to admit, my favorite pets are missing the multiple quantum correlations, 2 quantum, 3 quantum, and so on. But they are long forgotten, unfortunately.
not something we've worked with, I will admit, yes.
Istvan, let me just add to what I previously said about different delays in, for example, JHMBC. Because the useful magnetization that is used for other modules is kept along z-axis, it doesn't really affect the subsequent experiments, if that is what you had in mind.
Not really. It was just simply a technical issue, whether one acquisition time is 60 milliseconds longer than the other on top of each other, but that's fine. And I understand your simple solution to it, so that's best.
Okay.
I think there's a question from Goncalo, I believe, about the Noah Kolmar, where they're asking, do I find myself recording more scans in the Noah Kolmar experiments than I would normally? We generally will just record the Noah Kolmar. However, we record the HSQC, which I think we generally will do sort of either 8, 16, or 32 scans. 32 would be more for like HSQC Toxi. Whereas obviously Toxi is much more sensitive. So we end up getting a pretty big sensitivity boost for the Toxi because we're ending up running it twice as long as we would normally, or more even. We haven't implemented anything such like using, instead of the scans, getting more resolution. Eriks mentioned something about that with HMBC. That would be in theory possible. But for our workflow, we like our 1K indirect points. And so we just take the sensitivity boost.
Okay. And then there was a question also from Yong. Apologies if that pronunciation is not correct. I think you're still on the call. Do you want to speak to your question?
It's me. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's Jingu from Pennsylvania. I did run this because usually we only run COSI to scan, HSQC to scan, HMBC is 8 scans. But with this pulse sequence, what number of scan I should select? If I selected 2, is it going to sacrifice some sensitivity on HMBC?
Well, it is generally the case that you have to select the number of scans for the least sensitive experiment or least sensitive module in the combination. So if you had to run 8 for HMBC, then by default you will be running 8 for HSQC and 8 for COSI as well.
I see. Yeah, because I was thinking if it's a COSI, I only need 2 scans, but HMBC I do need 8 scans. So if I counted the time, I didn't save too much time with NOVA.
No, it gets to the stage where it's diminishing returns. So unless you're trading the time savings for sensitivity gains,
I see.
Generally, if you have to use a lot of scans for one of the modules, but fewer scans for the others, then the time savings you get relative to the separate experiments degrades, essentially, it diminishes. And you get to the stage whereby your time saving becomes 1, essentially. So there's really not any difference between running them separately with fewer number of scans, per experiment versus running the NOAA with a fixed number of scans and a high number of scans. So your optimum time saving situations does come when you can use few scans, and therefore things like cryoprobes or any high sensitivity setup will be beneficial.
Okay, got it.
And optimize the time savings.
Yeah, thanks.
I think it is a reasonable option. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's a reasonable option to split off the HMBC from the package, enjoy the time saving on the rest, and then run the HMBC separately.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea, and just run COSI HSQC with NOVA. That's going to save a lot of time.
Sure.
Well, I mean, if you record the whole NOAA3 HMBC, HSQC, and COSY, it's still going to be faster than recording the HMBC separately and then running HSQC plus COSY, assuming that you're using the same number of stands on the HMBC and the NOAA3. So in that case, I think another way to look at it is that you run the HMBC and you get the HSQC and the COSY for free, rather than
additional sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly, as Alex, with additional sensitivity, as opposed to 3 times time saving. Yeah, but it's always faster to combine experiments, even if they have slightly different sensitivities. It's just that the time saving decreases with lower sensitivity samples.
Thanks a lot.
A quick scan and see if there are any other questions that haven't been addressed so far. There was one from Mario, I was going to say, which is probably one for Eriks about the panacea. Oh yeah, Mario.
Yeah. I'm Mario from UGA. So my question is about that sensitivity enhancement. So if we use panacea, can we expect the same thing for carbon detection experiments, like inadequate?
Yes. Yeah, panacea is now quite an old experiment. I haven't really revisited it since I left Varian. You get the same sensitivity for inadequate, but the other modules start essentially with the bulk C13 magnetization. Okay, so HSQC would be less sensitive, but then because inadequate requires a lot of sample, that doesn't really matter. So it's limiting, the sensitivity limiting step, there is inadequate. So basically you get the other data, maybe not completely for free, but definitely you get some time savings there. But the sensitivity limited factor is inadequate.
Thank you.
I guess we're probably nearing our time threshold here. We've been going a couple of hours, so maybe there's just one question at the end we can address here, which is from Benjamin Bobe. In the NOAA experiments, can you set different SW values? The short answer is yes. I don't know if you're meaning for different nuclei there, or for the same nucleus in different modules. I don't know if Ben is still here, maybe, yeah. Would you like to clarify?
Yeah, I was just curious on if you were to run like a nitrogen HSQC followed by a carbon HSQC and then a COSY, how are the SW values set, and are those editable?
Yes, they are editable. I mean, typically you would set the carbon as you would for standard HSQC, say, and then there's a separate parameter which basically define as being the nitrogen spectral width. It's a constant value, and then the pulse program again will set the appropriate T1 increments to give you the correct frequency domain for the nitrogen dimension, and then that's corrected appropriately in the processing steps. So they are all editable to be different for the different nuclei.
Well, for proton, it's going to take the SW from the direct dimension. We just made that decision because people don't really do anything different frequently. Yeah,
for proton, it's an easy one, it's predefined by F2, essentially. So yeah, typically we would run, nitrogen and carbon dimensions with very different spectral widths, and that's included in there. Okay, maybe one last question. Is that okay, Krish? I don't know.
Yes, of course. Yes, we can go as long as there are questions.
Okay, all right. Ricardo, you've just put a good question in. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I can do that. So
Yeah, I get that. Well, as I wrote, I get the magnetization separation between the isotopes from what Alexander said, doing the separation of labeled carbon to unlabeled carbon for HSQC and then toxic. But how that is done when you have HMBC and HSQC? Because for those you would need the label, right? The proton to carbon 13.
Yeah, so in the HMBC, basically what's happening, so whereas I'm transferring proton to like sort of what I call the unlabeled proton to Y and the labeled proton to X, in the HMBC, it's preserving that one bond CH coupling along Z after it. I think it's just a single phase of the pulse, of the last pulse, whereas the signals that are proceeding via multibond are along X. Is that right?
Yeah.
Are transferred or something.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, but the one bond basically gets preserved, and the rest are continuing into the HMBC. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the HMBC then only has another 180-degree pulse in it, and then you detect antiphase, or not antiphase, but magnitude mode, right?
Yes.
So you don't lose. So then that one bond is just preserved along Z, and then you go straight into the HSQC off of that magnetization.
Yeah. Okay, so you don't expect to lose sensitivity between the two?
Not
no.
I don't.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
If I could make one last comment, because Eriks brought it up and I forgot to address it, and I think nobody really addressed it here, is that when you run these experiments in a NOAA fashion, all of the signals are, again, in every experiment, are being acquired with the exact same amount of heating from all of the decouplings and stuff. So you might imagine a cozy, run independently from an HSQC, run independently from a toxi. They all have different amounts of heating, and definitely in water samples, it becomes a big problem, and your peaks shift around. And so in metabolomics, for instance, you have to do complicated alignment processes to make sure all of your spectra are referenced the same way. But when you record experiments in NOAA, they just all the sequences overlap perfectly and automatically. So again, in our hands, it's a big bonus. I think for metabolome or for organic solvents, it's much less of an issue, heating between different experiments, but it was another sort of happy benefit for in our hands for NOAA.
That's an excellent point, particularly in this type of samples, biological derived samples. Yeah, I appreciate that. Are there any other questions? People can unmute themselves and directly ask questions if you still have something that you want to ask the panel.
There was one question that came up, which I'm not sure did address. Someone was asking about running NOAA within ICON NMR. Is that possible? The short answer is yes. Everything is compatible with ICON, so the data will be acquired and processed directly through ICON. Topspin and ICON can throw up some odd error messages because it doesn't fully understand what's going on under ICON NMR sometimes. However, the data do collect correctly and process correctly. ICON doesn't seem to know that it's done it correctly. So there are some quite odd conflicts there, sometimes in some of the later packages that we've seen, which need to be resolved, but essentially they will collect and they will acquire and process properly. So ICON is fine. We run that quite frequently in our lab.
Thank you. And if there are no other questions, I want to thank the panel leader, Tim Claridge, and the team that he put together. It's fantastic. In fact, in terms of total time of a panel discussion, we may have a photo finish between this and the non-uniform sampling by Frank Delaglio. We will figure it out which one has taken over the record. So thank you. Usually Dave Rice will have a gavel to close the meeting. I don't have one, so I now close the meeting. And thank you very much for everyone for coming, and look out for the next email about the next meeting. Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks for the panel members as well for joining in. Cheers all.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting.